All right, it's good to have you here with us tonight. A couple weeks ago, we started this series called The Red Sea Rules. Now, I mentioned there was a book that came across my desk by the name of this. I have the book right here, this little book, The Red Sea Rules. And I thought, that looks interesting, and I put it on my pile of books. I told myself at the beginning of the year, all the new books I get, I'm going to read through them before they go into the library. It's not happening very quickly. The pile's getting higher than I'm reading through them. But then I was talking with Pastor Holmes at the last pastor's conference, and he was telling me this book. He was doing a Bible study with the men there in DeSmet, and he was telling me about the Red Sea Rules. So I thought, well, I'll move this to the top of the list. And I started reading it, and I thought, boy, this would make a really good study to do. So we are going to be going through some things. Now, not everything that we're going to be doing is from the book, but we're taking, the rules here come from Exodus, come from the children of Israel as they come to the Red Sea. And these are rules drawn from this experience of the children of Israel, drawn from these passages. 10 rules, or if you will, guidelines, for helping us to navigate difficult times. All of us have, in some point in our life, faced difficult times, and I probably wouldn't be wrong in saying that I suspect that all of us probably in some way or another are facing some difficult times even now in our lives. And even in the context of us as a church and financially where we are, and that this is something that can be helpful to us. And again, as I began to read and went through some of these rules, wow, these are some really good thoughts here. And then we're going to go through some passages and look at some things here. So if you're interested in this little book, it's just an easy little read. I did purchase some copies of it, so if you're interested, chat with me about it. I think it was about $8. Yeah, $8 a piece. And so if you're interested in one, then talk to me about it, and we can get one for you. I have a few available, and if we need to, we can order some. So as we get into this, 10 God-given strategies for difficult times. And last time when we looked at this, we looked at rule number 1, and again, these come from Exodus 14. So if you want to turn there as we're talking about these, Exodus 14. Exodus 14 is the passage there. And so rule 1 is this: realize that God means for you to be where you are. And this comes from Exodus 14, verses 1 through 2. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel that they turn and encamp before Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, over against Baal-zephon. Before it shall ye encamp by the sea. So we talked about last time how God led the children of Israel out of Egypt, and he did so through Moses and Aaron. And of course, I think we all know the circumstances with Pharaoh there, and Pharaoh didn't want to let them go, and he finally did let them go. And so God led them out to the Red Sea. He led them with the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke, right? And so they're following God as he's leading them in his will, right? In the way that he wants them to go. And they're following him. And God says to Moses, take them to this place and camp there by the sea. Now, did God know that Pharaoh was going to come after them with the chariots and come to kill them? Yeah, he did know that. And remember, just for context's sake, most scholars agree that it's somewhere around 4 million people, the children of Israel at this point. That's not just a few people that can swim across the Red Sea. And how do you get all the animals and the wagons and all the things? That's a huge undertaking. So they're there at the Red Sea. Pharaoh is coming, and they can probably hear the chariots from miles away. What do we do? And of course, the people, we know the response of the people. They begin to murmur and complain against God and against Moses. But the concept that we talked about last time is this: God led them to that place. God led them to the place where the Egyptians were going to come, and there was going to be no way that the people could turn. He led them to a difficult time, and seemingly to them, there was no way out. And so that's something that we need to realize. Rule number 1 when we face difficult times: realize that God means for you to be where you are. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that God caused the situation where you are, because we know in the case of Job that God allowed Satan to attack Job and his family and do things to him. But God's in control and he's sovereign, right? Which means he allowed it to happen. Which means that he meant for Job to be where he was. And he means for us to be where we are. That's hard for us to come to grips with, but it is very important for us. Understand that God has us right where he wants us to be. And the other thing we talked about last time was, but what if it's my fault? Just like Joseph's brothers, it was their fault that Joseph was put into slavery. And yet, God was able to take the sin and the wicked thing that they did and use it for his glory and use it to be what saved them when they needed it in the drought. God is bigger than my failures, right? That's an incredible realization, because sometimes the difficulty that we're in is our fault. And those sometimes can be the hard ones for us to get past. Even if it's my fault, is God sovereign still? Yeah. Did God know I would make a mistake and mess up? Yeah. Well, then God still means for me to be where I am. So that's rule number 1. Tonight we're going to get to rule number 2. Be more concerned for God's glory than for your relief. Be more concerned for God's glory than your relief. So let's look at the passage here. Exodus 14, 3-4. So he said, encamp against the sea, or by the sea, for Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, they are entangled in the land, the wilderness hath shut them in, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart. Now, in Sunday school, we've talked about this a little bit, but I do just want to mention here, because some people really like to latch on to this, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and that whole Calvinism debate, and that whole, did we choose, does God choose, is it our will, free will, do we have free will, or is it just God's total sovereignty? And the real answer is that yes, we choose, and yes, God is sovereign. And even in this, God said, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. But I do find it interesting that in 3 separate occasions it talks about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. And one time it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Another time it says that Satan hardened Pharaoh's heart. And another time it says that Pharaoh hardened Pharaoh's heart. Well, which one did? I maintain that all three were involved in the process. Pharaoh chose to harden his heart. Satan might have done the act of the hardening, and God allowed it to happen. Because God, just in Romans 1, left him to his reprobate mind. And so, God says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and then I will be honored, he says, verse 4 here. I will be honored upon Pharaoh and upon all his host, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord. And they did so. So, if we follow rule number 1, God means for me to be where I am, then that means that God is going to receive the glory for this situation. However it is resolved in the end, whether God removes me from it or whether God takes me through the hard path, God will receive the glory, right? And so that brings us to this second rule, that in the midst of trial, make the conscious choice, rule number 2, be more concerned for God's glory than my relief. Now, nobody said these rules were easy, okay? But because in the midst of suffering, pain and suffering and agony and whatever it is we're going through, all that we want is for this to be over, for it to be done, and for us to be through this. That shouldn't be our main concern. Our main concern is God going to be glorified in the way that I am acting through this trial, through this difficulty? So that means we need to ask the right questions. So then what are the wrong questions? In the midst of a trial, here's some of the wrong questions. How did I get into this mess, and how can I get out of it? Now, to us, that's a pretty logical question to ask. But if we are focusing on God's glory more than our getting out of this suffering, that's not the right question to ask. Or this one, how quickly can I solve this problem? A lot of times we try to solve the problem, don't we? And we shouldn't be. And sometimes the problem is not meant to be solved. The problem is meant to be endured, that God receive the glory. Or, why did this have to happen to me? These are not the right questions to ask when we face difficult times. The right question to ask is this: how can God be glorified in this situation? And I'm telling you, if we can really understand this, and it's not easy to do, and our emotions aren't going to feel like doing this in the midst of hardship. And so this is choosing God in God's way to say, God, how can you be glorified in this situation? How do I need to act or react or endure this that you can be glorified in this? Let's take a look at John chapter 9, verses 1 through 3. John 9. So John chapter 9, verse 1, and as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? So here they are, asking the wrong question. See, their belief is that if something horrible happens to you, like blindness, then that means that you did something wrong. They also believe in God talks about in the Old Testament a generational curse and the sins of the father being passed down. And so they asked Jesus, who sinned? Did this man sin, that he was born blind, or was it his parents that sinned? So in other words, what's the question they're asking? Who's at fault for this man's suffering? That's not the right question. And Jesus, verse 3, answered, neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents, neither one. But that the works of God should be made manifest in him. Sometimes difficulty and suffering like this man's blindness, nobody sinned. This wasn't anybody's fault. And even still, that's not the right question to ask. The right question to ask is, how can God be glorified in this situation? And so Jesus says, this man is made blind so that the works of God can be made manifest. Did this man know that one day Jesus would heal him of his blindness? No, he didn't know that. And there's many today that are not healed from their blindness or whatever it is that they're enduring. But the question to ask is, how can the works of God be made manifest? Or in other words, how can God be glorified in this situation? So what happened in this situation? Well, if we skip down to verse 7, and said unto him, go, wash in the pool of Siloam, which is by interpretation sent. He went his way thereof and washed and came seeing. So the man was born with blindness, not his fault or his parents. Nobody sinned. Jesus comes and heals him, and who receives the glory for that? You can say it. God, right? God receives the glory in this situation. Yes, it's difficult, but again, God meant for him to be where he was, and God sought for his glory in this situation. Now, we also know that God is he means for our good and his glory, and we can trust God. John 12:27 and 28, now is my soul troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this cause came I unto this hour. Now, who's speaking here? Jesus. Jesus says, my soul is troubled. This is right after his triumphal entry. And very soon he's going to be laying down his life on the cross. And Jesus says, now my soul is troubled. What shall I say? Should I say, Father, save me from this hour? No. It's for this cause came I unto this hour. Father, glorify thy name. And we know that even Jesus, he prayed that this cup would pass, but still he prayed that God would be glorified. Then came there a voice from heaven saying, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. So what's the it is his name. Even Jesus, who is the example to us in his humanity, said, what would I say? God, take this away from me? No. This is what I'm here for, to glorify God. So God, Father, glorify thy name. When we're in the midst of trial, we do need to focus on this and focus our prayers on this. God, glorify your name in this. Again, that's not what our flesh wants to do, but there's something that happens when we do this. Our focus is not on our situation. It's not on our pain. It's not on our misery. Our focus is instead on God. And it's on me making sure that God is being glorified in what I am enduring through. This is the purpose for which we are made, to glorify God by choosing him and his way. Suffering, the answer to suffering, the answer to depression, the answer to all of these things that we suffer in this life, the thing that brings us hope is when we are fulfilling our purpose in the Lord and glorifying Him. Our flesh doesn't want to go there, and Satan doesn't want us to go there, but that's where we need to go. Psalm 106, 7 through 8. Our fathers understood not thy wonders in Egypt. So this is the psalmist speaking of the children of Israel in Egypt. They remembered not the multitude of thy mercies, but provoked him at the sea, even at the Red Sea. They came to the sea and they didn't remember your mercies, Lord. Nevertheless, he saved them for his name's sake. Not for their sake, and yes, he did, but ultimately for his glory, for his name's sake, that he might make his power to be known. Now, that means then that as we endure hardship and endure this trial, this is going to be done in His own way. The answer to our suffering, as we pray, ultimately we should make sure that we are praying that God would receive the glory through this. But, admittedly, the Lord doesn't always deliver us from our problems in the way that we want Him to, right? He does it His way, but in the long run, His way is always best. And it always leads to worship, because it always leads us back to Him. Psalm 50, verse 15, and call upon me in the day of trouble. I will deliver thee, and thou shalt glorify me. Psalm 34:19, many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivereth him out of them all. Now, that doesn't mean that God's necessarily going to take it away, does it? That may be what we want God to do, but God isn't always going to do so in His way. Sometimes it means walking through the fire. But we know that if we walk through the fire, He's going to do so with us, right? And that in the end, He will receive the glory. So that brings us back to rule number 2. When we come into hardships, and I challenge you to either write these down or if you get a hold of the book, but definitely write these rules down and have them somewhere. And when you find yourself in hardship, pull these out and remind yourself of these rules. Rule number 1, to remember that we are where God wants us to be, right? And rule number 2, be more concerned for God's glory than for your relief. So that brings us to our application question tonight. Am I more concerned for God's glory than my relief? Now, as I said, I don't know where people are individually, and maybe you're in the midst of suffering now. But if you aren't now, I'm sure one day you will be. And remember these rules. And this is something I think that would be helpful to us to get a hold of. And so we ask ourselves this evening, and I challenge you to ask yourself this: am I really more concerned for God's glory than my relief? I think that takes some evaluation, and it takes a specific choice to put God first and not myself. Let's pray.